So now we're continuing on in our science textbook. This is grade 8 science. This is chapter 2.1 on unicellular organisms. So it's grade 8 science, chapter 2.1 on unicellular organisms. Now this is only the first part of today's lesson, so we'll call this part A. Now, unicellular, if we break this up, uni means one, and cellular, well, means cellular. So this is an organism that is consisted of one cell. Now, there are different examples of these types of organisms, but we can categorize them into 5 kingdoms of life. And you may have learned this in an earlier grade. But all of life can be separated into 5 kingdoms, and then that can be separated into phyla, and then classes, orders, and other classifications. So the 5 kingdoms of life are as follows. Well, we start with the one we're most familiar, and that's the animal kingdom, or the Latin term is animalia. And we're going to come up with different examples of unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. So if we look at the first one, and if we look at animalia, an example of a multicellular organism would be the human, or a cat, or a dog, alligator, any animal that's composed of more than one cell. The unicellular animal example that is most often seen is the amoeba. And we'll be looking at the amoeba a little bit more specifically in the next lesson. The next kingdom that we have is the plant kingdom, or plantae. The multicellular version of this one could be really any tree that you can think of. So a maple tree, a fig tree, a palm tree. And a unicellular plant would be something called like a diatom, or algae, or plankton. But the photosynthetic plankton, not the zooplankton. There's a third kingdom called fungi, and the most familiar one that we know of is the mushroom, which is a multicellular organism. Now, there is a unicellular equivalent. There are lots, and they're very, very small, and yeast is an example of a unicellular organism that's a fungus. You might know yeast most commonly as the substance that helps bread rise, that when heated it lets out it emits a certain gas, and then that helps the bread to rise in the oven. Now, there are 2 kingdoms that specifically are only unicellular organisms. The first ones are the protista, or the protists, and an example of this one is the paramecium. There are no examples of multicellular protists. There are, however, if we look specifically at what the definition of a protist is, there are some, but we don't need to know it for this level. The last, and probably the largest, I suppose, is kingdom Monera, and this is all of the bacteria. And there are no multicellular bacteria. They're all unicellular. So unicellular organisms can be divided into 5 kingdoms, and they each have the same functions as a regular plant or animal cell that we studied in the past. And we'll be looking at some of the functions and the behaviors of the amoeba and the plankton and the diatom as we look closer at unicellular organisms. And then we'll be looking at multicellular organisms and seeing how they use unicellular organisms as a backdrop or a foundation to how a multicellular organism can work. So that is our first lesson on unicellular organisms and their classifications.